So I'm a little bit of an outsider because I don't come from the Swedish Food Agency, but rather from another agency, which is the Swedish Agency for Chemicals. And I'm going to say a little bit about us because you probably know about the Swedish Agency for the Food Control, but not about us. We were established in quite 1987. We're about now 250 employees. We actually are under the Ministry for the Environment and the Energy. And we deal with national, EU, international work. We also deal integrated with human health and the environment. That's a little bit different for our agencies compared with other ones. And we're the competent authority for the plant product protection regulation, biocide product regulation for REACH CLP, but we're also involved in many other activities. And we're dealing basically with approvals, risk assessment, risk management, enforcement, and development of regulations. And we have ongoing as an action plan a non-toxic environment, so we have quite a bit of money to sort of focus on such things as substances of very high concern, including endocrine disrupting chemicals, and our focus mainly here is essentially on children as well. So it was very interesting to hear Anna's presentation. We can be found there, and although I'm saying it's a little bit the odd one out, the outsider, we of course have a coupling to the food contact materials through REACH, the such things as bisphenol A, which you've heard about, the phthalates. And we also have a coupling through circular economy, chemicals in plastics, which I think are supposed to be quite well regulated for the food contact materials. What I'm going to talk about today is to try and orientate you about what's been happening, at least from the point of view of trying to develop a agreed definition for endocrine disruptors and criteria. And what I'm going to be talking about is what's been happening since 2009, and I'll tell you why since 2009, the Commission's activities on the development of criteria, and Sweden's activities in dealing with the endocrine disruptor criteria work. And you'll understand why I include Sweden there later on. Basic requirements, I believe, and other people believe, are we need a definition. We need to know what to regulate. What is an endocrine disruptor or what is not? You also need test information, and testing guidelines has been talked about and touched upon. Mainly we get those from the OECD and how to detect it. That is how to detect these endocrine disruptors once we've defined them. Here there's a little problem because the OECD test guidelines are being developed and there aren't really set test guidelines that we can actually use in REACH. And then we need to have some criteria and how to really translate test outcomes into regulations. We need to have some criteria to be able to start looking at the test information and then to start categorizing these particular endocrine disruptors, and then to see if we need to regulate them. Where I come in, and from my perspective, which is probably not your perspective, is basically in 2009, there was adaptation of a regulation for the plant protection products. And in there was placed into different articles some paragraphs, and one of the paragraphs was, it said, we don't have any criteria. We don't really even have a definition. How do we deal with endocrine disruptors? Well, let's treat them as though they're carcinogenic category 2. Category 2 is a classification under something called CLP, the classification and labeling and packaging regulation. And that's very important. That's a horizontal regulation and applies to many other downstream regulations. And also reproductive effects in category 2. Of course, what's missing here, you obviously can see this is to do with health. It's not to do with the environment. There's also another caveat in all of this. This has to be classified. Who classifies? I'll come back to that if I remember, hopefully. There was also written into the regulation that there was a need for scientific criteria by the 14th of December 2013. We've missed that date already. In 2010, another regulation for biocide products came into operation and entered into force. It says active substances which, on the basis of the criteria, are considered as having endocrine disrupting properties that may cause adverse effects in humans should be dealt with. And it was this may cause adverse effects, not absolutely have to have, which is an interesting legal term in a regulation. It was also written in there that interim criteria apply for human health. Still nothing for the environment. And that's the carcinogenic category 2 and reproductive category 2. And that there should, it's one day earlier, no later than December the 13th, 2013, there should be scientific criteria for the determination of endocrine disrupting properties. To quickly go back, I can say one of the problems with the interim criteria is that they haven't succeeded yet in delivering a verdict on one single chemical. Another little problem is, I say, classification. Within this area, there's a question of who classifies. EFSA can make a recommendation, and they thought that was binding. It's actually contested at present by the Commission, and it should go through the CLP expert group, which is called a committee for, it's called RAC, and it's a Risk Assessment Committee, and that's responsible for deciding on the recommendation for classifications. So there's a contention here, and there's a problem. The interim criteria haven't delivered, and they don't really offer a safeguard according to my way of looking at it, though there are others who think they are very sort of guarding. What I'm going to talk about here is what actually happened from up until 2013 and from 2011. I can say I'm also an outsider to this actual area. I've actually only been involved in endocrine disruptors for about 1.5 years. I've been involved in many other things, but it was totally fascinating to try and get a grip on. I said, I'm going to try and orientate you to actually try and orientate myself. It was actually like watching a sort of a thriller, a scientific film, there were episodes, there were trilogies, and there were remakes, according to me, and there were aspects of science, non-science, policy, emotions, and everything involved, and it's very hard to actually keep a handle on what's actually going on at any one time. And NGOs are actually involved in this, just quickly, and very influential, but there are many other parties involved in this as well. From 2011 to 14, DG Environment had the mandate for actually deciding on a definition and or recommending and actually developing criteria. DG Sanko, as it was called then, was also involved, but they had slightly differing views at certain times. 2011, I mean, there was an agreement made, 2009, 2011, that the Commission wanted criteria developed. And so they had this mandate handed down to them. There was a revision of community strategy for endocrine disruptors. I'm not going to talk about that. But that led to that an expert advisory group and different expert working groups were set up. And there was a great deal of work which carried on from about 2012 up until about 2013 to discuss what type of criteria would be adequate. And actually it got to the stage that a draft was handed to inter-service consultation within the Commission, and that draft actually held a definition and criteria. I'll get back to that. There were actually, during this time, different publications, and one of them was a state of art on the endocrine disruptors by Kottenkamp, Andreas, in 2012. That was commissioned by the European Union. Within the United Nations, there was this sort of was it WHO UNEP report, The State of Science and Endocrine Disrupting Chemicals, which is very sort of a milestone. Then there came actually a report from EFSA, from Scientific Committee, an opinion in March 2013, very unexpected. And it more or less said, I mentioned it was supposed to be scientific hazard-based criteria. They said, no, it should be risk-based criteria. So that was a little bit of a turning point and an upset. So things stopped about 2013, and it's very difficult to understand really why they did stop. There are lots of different theories put forward, there's lots of explanations, and there's lots of finger-pointing. And basically, it was said that it was realized that, that the proposal, which I said, had gone forward to the inter-service consultation, would lead to great upset of trade within the European Union. It would also be that these type of criteria and the definition would actually have knock-on effects to downstream regulations. Downstream regulations, I say now. Other regulations, I should say, because this work was started because of the plant protection and the biocide product regulation. It went around in circles, and July, which I haven't written up, 2013, it was decided by the Secretariat General that an impact assessment had to be done, and it had to be harmonized criteria, and that means harmonized for all regulations. But strangely enough, the works did carry on, as in October there was a scientific agreement, and the scientific advisor, Anna Glover, organised a meeting to see what the scientists had in agreement, or where the issues laid. Because one of the other little problems why this stopped, or it said it was stopped, this process, was there was a lot of scientific critique. And the critique went to say that this particular report by WHO, UNEP, was not substantial, it was not believable, and it was not scientifically founded. I'm not going to go into all of this because it goes around in circles, but we tried to be concrete about this, and once we realized what was going on, we and Denmark actually wrote a letter to the Commission for the Environment and Industry, that's Enterprise at that time, to ask, well, what's going on? We didn't really get a good answer back, but we realized everything was halted. And then about a year later, we decided to commence on a lawsuit, and that was a lawsuit against the EU Commission for failure for developing the endocrine disrupting chemical criteria. And that's because it's written into the articles of the two different regulations for plant protection and biocides. And that agreement was an agreement before 2009, and it's binding as we look at it. This court case or the lawsuit, it's not actually in a court case, is carrying on. We have got actual support from Council, Parliament, France, Finland, Denmark, Netherlands, and that's in 2015. What's happening now? There has been an exchange of opinions, which probably none of you have seen, and we've got to the point now that we're considering Sweden to ask for a hearing to speed up the whole process. But we hope that will occur within the next 6 months, and we believe that there should be a decision made on this by about the end of 2016. To come back to that in a moment. I should say that there were other reactions, there were other changes, and there were other actions. And as I said, the NGOs got very involved and really did accuse the Commission of, I won't say it. Then what happened? Juncker came into action, and he decided to change Sanko into Santi and took away the mandate from Environment. And Santi, DG Santi, are responsible for developing the definition and criteria. There's a roadmap which was produced in 2014, and I'm not too sure if this is the Sanko or the Santi that did this, but in that roadmap it talks about that now we have to develop criteria looking at an impact assessment because of these consequences for downstream regulations, because of the consequence for trade, because actually they said in the 7th Environmental Action Plan, it requires that for horizontal effects and for horizontal changes of regulations, you require an impact assessment. However, that depends how you read the 7th Environmental Action Plan. I don't read it like that. Anyway, this roadmap in 2014 outlined a definition, criteria options, and regulatory options. Next step, there was a public consultation, started last year, ended at the beginning of this year, and I'll come back to that as well. And there's been meetings, and there's been roundtables for NGOs, member states, for the MEPs, 2-hour meetings to be informed by Santi what's going on. There's been a EDC conference, the 1st of June. I can't remember, I think there's about 200 people there. It was pretty intensive. There wasn't much time to really discuss too much. And then there's been some work set up for the JRC, a screening methodology, which I'm not going to go into. And if you would sum all this up, the criteria just might be available via the impact assessment process by 2017. Well, what did the public consultation propose? Well, it proposed the WHO definition, and that is an endocrine disruptor is an exogenous substance mixture that alters functions of the endocrine system and consequently causes adverse effects in intact organisms or its progeny or subpopulations. They also propose, which is in the roadmap and the public consultation, that there should be 4 options, 1, 2, 3, 4. This is the baseline, there's no change, keep interim rules. I might say if this is going to be the baseline, then one should actually take into account what's happening now and not what has happened, because you've got to look at integrated pest management. There's ways of doing impact assessments, and there's non-ways of doing them. And then there was option 2, and that was just to have a definition. But if you just have a definition, that's a yes or no assessment. It's sort of, you decide whether a chemical is an endocrine disruptor or not. And we don't have the test to really do that. And what happens to those potential or suspected. And then there was an option 3, and that was to have the definition, but including divisions into categories based on strength of evidence. Basically, you could say that you could demonstrate it's an endocrine disruptor. It is a suspected endocrine disruptor. You just need a couple more tests to know yes or no it is an endocrine disruptor. Or it could be that it's a potential. There's something there which says, oh, it seems to have a mode of action. So you put it on a waiting list, and hopefully you would actually stimulate research or testing. And then there was another option, and that was a definition, but this would be limited by having specified potency. So potency is a part of risk characterization. And the problem with this, as we see it, is that potency is only one part of risk characterization. And if you're going to look at potency, you should look at exposure. So you're in the world of risk assessment. Remember what it said in the plant protection and biocide regulations? Hazard-based. Just got to quickly peep at the next one. There was also any regulatory options which were placed in, because now all of a sudden this roadmap didn't talk about criteria or hazard-based, it was talking about regulatory options. And it wanted those regulatory options such as negligible exposure or acute risk to food production or many other things, cultural heritage, constructions that needed to be protected would be exempt from using endocrine disruptors. This is written some different caveats into the plant protection and to the biocide regulations. But they also said, oh, let's go even further. Let's create risk assessment and even go further. Let's combine this with further socioeconomic considerations. So, it's become very, very complicated. I did say that there's been a public consultation. They've begun to summarize those results. Needless to say, Sweden opted for this with the different categories. But let's see, other parties opted for other options. There was 27,000 replies. There were many from industry. There were many from replies from outside of Europe. And in the initial analysis, it seems that there is a sort of tendency to want option 4. However, this particular public consultation wasn't really seeking sort of a popularity vote, it was seeking information. But what you see about the results of public consultation actually happened to be a type of the result of a ballot in the way it's portrayed. And so there seems to be a tendency in what's written today that everyone wants option 4. Everyone? Not really everyone, because the public also actually became involved in this particular public consultation, and many of them actually opted for option 3. Who want option 4? That's industry, that's non-government, that's governmental agencies outside of Europe, actually the US, Canada, the Netherlands, New Zealand, and one country, Australia rather. They want option 4, and you think, well, why are they involved? And I think from what I've seen written and what's been coming from both Australia and from America, it has a tight coupling to this thing called the TTIP, which is the Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership, if I remember correctly. I'm not going to go into that, but quite fascinating. And we, Sweden and other countries, Denmark, Netherlands, they wanted option A, don't tamper with the other regulations. But many others, such as industry and such as even non-EU government organisations, prefer option C. So it's becoming complicated. As I mentioned earlier on, that we're expecting criteria from this process, the impact assessment, by about, 2017. In this other parallel world, so it's not rather like you switch worlds, we have the lawsuit. And that might be complete and a ruling made on that by the end of 2016. If the ruling is made in favour of Sweden, and we keep our fingers crossed, that will mean we're going to have to adopt hazard-based criteria, which would mean there's an awful lot of time and money gone wasted on the impact assessment. And there are other legal problems with actually starting up the impact assessment, but I won't go into those. So my summary is, in conclusion, criteria are urgently required. We need them. We need a way forward. This is costing money. It's costing health effects. We've seen there's been several publications on the cost benefits. We're awaiting the conclusion of the Swedish lawsuit, as I say, hopefully, 2016. Just to remind you, we support option 3. This is KEMI. It's not really Sweden, because we do this independently, because we have that type of mandate. We also see that there's a need for an open meeting of scientific experts because of this thing about the disagreement, the issues, rebuttals, accusations. Really, the scientists do need to re-meet. And I think Anna Grover did a good job in actually, after this was put on hold under DG Environment, she tried to get the scientific community together. But we need to do that again, I think. And I think looking at the impact assessment, well, we got to follow that road. We're in split beam mode or action mode, but this should be definitely transparent. I think Santi is trying to do a good job here. It's got to be thorough. Yes, that will take time, but it's got to be objective as well. So, with that, I thank you.